Hey, everybody. We are live. I am joined with Caleb Maupin here. Today is the premiere of Horseshoe Theory is Right, but Not How You Think, which is the quintessential both sides are bad documentary. Is going to make a lot of people mad because they're going to not pay attention to what I'm actually saying. They're just going to look at the thumbnail and, get angry about that. How are you, Caleb?
I'm good. Getting over a little bit of a cold, but very excited for this premiere. I have seen the film, and it's a good one. And it says many, many important things, many, many important points. So I hope people tune in and enjoy it.
One might say, very important. Very important, maybe.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it's got a lot of your humor in it, which is very uniquely you, right? I mean, it's your style where you use kind of that humor to get the important points across. So yes,
Yeah,
I've seen it.
the way I go ahead. Sorry.
I was just saying I've seen it, and I give it my full endorsement. So there we go.
Excellent. Excellent. There's obviously some provocative stuff. There's some funnier things in it. That's not normally the CPI way per se. We kind of try to keep things fairly official, but also when I'm making stuff that's my stuff, I like to try to be funny in more than one way. I like kind of giving some sugar to help the medicine go down a little bit. It's not an easy subject to talk about. When you say both sides are bad, people just get really mad at you because you're talking to people who have picked a side, and no matter what, you're telling them that their side is bad. And I think that's the main reason they can't tolerate that. There was that singer over the last month, Chappelle Roan, who said both sides are bad, and people went absolutely nuts about it for like weeks and attacked her, and she canceled shows because she got canceled really hard. And it was taking a toll on her mental health. So, yeah, I mean, people get mad. They get mad at this topic.
Well, it's funny because there are a lot of people who will say things like both sides are bad, but they're just doing it to be lazy. They're just not too political, and they're just like, oh, both sides are bad. Trump, Kamala, they're all the same. I'm tired of it. Let's turn on the football game. There's that, and then you get careerists, right, who are trying to play it safe, right? And they don't want to. They got both sides in their audience. They're like, well, I see aspects of both sides,
Yeah.
But we actually mean both sides are bad. We've actually done the research and investigated both sides thoroughly and come to the conclusion that both sides are bad. And so it's a completely different brand. And I think that that's important to keep in mind.
I think that it's interesting because so many people have that instinct that both sides are bad because both sides just continually fail them. Like the Democrats are constantly promising things and not delivering. The Republicans are doing the same. It's not like it's an absurd thing to observe. It's just the place that it leads to when you're not really doing any kind of material analysis is kind of stasis or even like paralysis. And I think the thing that makes this a unique documentary is that it doesn't go that like we start from material analysis. We start from the French Revolution, where the left-right paradigm came from, where the left represented the bourgeoisie, the right represented the feudal aristocracy. It was a physical separation in a room that it came from. And they represented different classes. And obviously one of those classes won out and absorbed the other class. And the idea is, well, maybe there isn't actually a material distinction between left and right. Maybe there's some ideals, but ultimately those ideals are attempting to rewire things and get it back to the same goal. And that's how both sides are bad. Not necessarily just that, I have observed that I don't like Kamala and I don't like Trump. Or even worse, like a lot of people use both sides are bad to kind of mask their support for one side. And I think that that's also lazy. And I made a video about Trump and Kamala. You watched it the other day, Caleb, and it was about crime and how the only way you would actually solve any bit of the crime issue is by addressing the economic issues that leaves people in destitute situations. And ultimately, like, I got a big barrage of the same kind of, you're just masking your support for Trump. And like, you saw that video, right? Like, I think, ruthlessly critiqued what Trump was saying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well,
it's weird.
I have noticed that one thing you do get from people with like mainstream political perspectives that are smarter than that is that they just listen to one side and all the bad things that side says. And they try to tend to ignore all the stupid shit that their own side says as a way to like protect themselves, right? And that's a way to cover yourself and take sides, but you're not being intellectually honest if you do that. I've seen that from both sides. Yeah.
Yeah. Ironically,
right.
Yeah, it's an issue that I've cared about for a really long time, because as long as I've been an adult, I've registered as an independent, except for in the Democratic primary with Bernie Sanders the first time, because I lived in a state where you weren't allowed to vote without registering for the primary as a Democrat. You couldn't vote in the Democrat primary. So for one election, I was registered as a Democrat, but I as soon as I was able to, I changed it back to independent. When I moved back to my home state of Michigan, that is an open primary state. So I didn't have to, I've registered as an independent after moving back into the state. And it's just like, I've never in my life felt like one of these two sides actually served my needs. When Obama ran, like, there was a lot of new rhetoric and there was a lot of talk of change and a lot of rejection of the previous presidency. But ultimately, it didn't happen. Like, ultimately, we're in a more or less fundamentally similar situation, pre-Obama, post-Obama, et cetera, et cetera. Those things didn't change. Like, the guy was very good at talking. And I'm not going to say that there were zero redeeming qualities about him either, but I'm not going to say that about any of the last several presidents. They're human beings. Of course, something is redeeming about them, and some policy idea they have, there's some redeeming aspect of them. But ultimately, like, we're in a fundamentally similar or the same situation with little changes around the edges. And it seems bizarre to me that somebody, particularly these leftists who claim to be socialists, I target them a little bit more than the right wing, because the right wing is so straightforward. You don't really have to do a lot to expose what their views are, whereas the left is less straight. Like, I use this this comparison later in the documentary. I said the right wing is like physical abuse and the left wing is like emotional abuse. Physical abuse is obviously bad, of course. Like, it's indefensible, but it's also not the bigger obstacle, because you don't have to prove it's happening once somebody hits you. It's very easy to prove that, like, whether you have a witness or a black eye or, marks on you, et cetera, et cetera. But it's very hard to prove that you're being emotionally abused. That's a very difficult thing to prove. And that's kind of how I view the left-right thing. Like, I don't, like, any kind of abuse to me is just like automatically inexcusable, but it's so much more difficult to show what's going on in the emotional abuse. It's harder to prove, it's harder to criticize, it's harder to tell other people what's going on, because it's so easy for somebody to be like, yeah, you're exaggerating. And that's, to me, the most pure way of expressing the difference between the two, and why I ended up probably criticizing them more, because there's just more to reveal,
Indeed. By the way, I just moved so I could have better reception. I think my image is probably coming in much clearer now.
It is.
But yeah, but I will say that what this film does a really good job of breaking down is this notion that if you're an advocate of socialism, you have this loyalty to the left. And there's this big scary thing called the right wing that it is always our duty to fight against. And that mindset is something that I find to be very, very persuasive, or pervasive, not persuasive, but pervasive.
For certain people.
right, in the circles that we run in. And you were talking about Obama and how Obama changed things. Really, since the Obama presidency, politics in the United States has gotten so mishmashed and confused and mixed up. It is not what it used to be. And that I think a lot of the people that are still on this fight the right wing track, they are like following a very, very old script. But even that old script was wrong. We just didn't know how wrong it was until recently. It took a major crisis in society for things to get wrong. And that's where I give credit to people like the Schiller Institute and others, because they were realizing it was wrong even back in the 70s, but it wasn't as obviously wrong as it is now. And that the point
also,
of yeah,
go ahead. Sorry.
Well,
I was going to say,
go ahead. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, just that the point that you highlight in the film about growth versus degrowth being such an important aspect of things nowadays. That is really, something that I think has become really, really pronounced, but was, it was a process that started in the 1960s, as you show in the film when you talk about Congress for Cultural Freedom and all of that. But it's really, really pronounced that seems to be the divide in our times, is growth versus degrowth.
Yeah, I would have to say I mostly agree with that point. And that's why, most of my documentaries, I find some way to talk about degrowth, even if it's not the main subject, because it's kind of like, if not the most important dichotomy, it's in the top three. It's such an important divide to talk about, because you have it on, again, both sides. There's the right-wing localism, and the march for war is ultimately a form of degrowth. And then you on the left have just straightforward degrowth, which anybody who has read Fascism and Social Revolution by R. Palm Dutt can easily identify these things as what leads to fascism, because it's ultimately, you talk about the reduction of the productive forces, the rage against the machine, and the machine just being technology and automation, which we see tons of that in the contemporary left. I've had people for a year now screaming at me for saying AI isn't plagiarism.
Right.
It's really, it's pronounced when you look at it. And the thing is, I do talk about the previous paradigm, CPUSA in the United States, which did identify as left. But I feel like the reason that they were effective is because that really wasn't their fundamental thing. They weren't going, we're the left and we got to fight the right. They were fundamentally oriented towards class. So even though they were calling themselves left, the dichotomy that they were operating on wasn't left-right. It was workers, bourgeoisie. It was capitalists versus the people that they exploit. And that's the divide. That's the thing that matters. It's the thing that all the other things spring forward from. And that's what we have to talk about. And that's basically what I'm trying to say in the documentary. But, even though they identified as left, I think that it's important to understand that materially, it doesn't really matter what your ideology is if you're actually advocating for and working towards addressing the contradictions of capitalism, which again, we get into that a little bit in the documentary too, with overproduction. You are giving a speech that will also, I believe, go through overproduction in the event we're going to be at next Saturday. Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about the event and all of that?
Yeah, well, it's going to be very exciting. Peter and I are headed to the Chicagoland area next Saturday, a week from yesterday. 6 days from now, we will be having an all-day workshop. The theme is Working Families First, Build the Economy, Not the Empire. We've got a great number of people registered for it already, but we could obviously use more people at it. So your registration is still open if you want to join us. There'll be good food, good music, and you'll get to hear from Peter and myself. And there'll be a lot of interactive workshops. It's going to be pretty great in many, many ways. I'm really excited about it. Just trying to scramble together to get all the loose ends tied up and get it together. And got my flight out to Chicago. And yeah, it's going to be great. I know a lot of people that work with the Center for Political Innovation are very excited and working very hard. Gabby, Ellie, John, others, other folks are excited about it. And good music. There'll be a live musician, as always. Can't do an event without music. And it's going to be good. all around. I did want to briefly, touch on a couple things that you mentioned about the left and the right, which is that, for a long time, especially during the Cold War, the Soviet Union was kind of this like anchor, I guess you could say, or the center of gravity that because the Soviet Union was considered to be left, and like, the global communist movement was considered to be left, one could measure left and right based on that. And so it was a little bit different. And that's when you talk about CPUSA. And that also the forces that called themselves left, they had to negotiate to some degree with something that was beyond left and right, which, you know what I'm saying? Like the,
Absolutely.
the called themselves left had to, to some degree or other, try to manipulate or negotiate with people that were under the influence of this wider communist movement. And so that made left better, I guess you could say. But left and right have always existed. And you talk in the film about the aristocrats versus the emerging capitalists. And Marx talks about that too. And he talks about, in Capital, he talks about the first working class movement that ever emerged in Europe. And it actually came from the so-called right, because what it was you had the emerging capitalist class, which was the left, and then you had the landowning capitalists, who were the former aristocrats who owned the land. And they were fighting with each other. And so it was the aristocrats, the right, that started subsidizing and promoting the labor movement because they were fighting against the factory owners. And so the first working class movement in the history of our time actually originated in a strategic alliance with the right, the landowning capitalists, against the so-called left, the new industrial class. So that's the point, is that the point is to win, right? The point is to change the world and advance the working class movement. The point is not to just be eternally loyal to one faction against the other. And at the end of the day, we are against both factions. We have a vision for a whole new society. And that, while left, like during the 20th century, was heavily influenced by the existence of the communist movement, we're in a period where that's not the case. And I think that's also why the left has gotten so bad. The reason that the left seemed better throughout the Cold War was because it was anchored by having to negotiate with communism or the Soviet Union, which was considered to be part of the left. And communism and the Soviet Union existed as part of a wider sphere that included the labor movement, included like the organized peace movements and groups that maybe they weren't fully where the Soviet Union was at, but they were more sympathetic than others. And all of that has just been so completely eroded that now the left of capital is free to just be what it is: degrowth, Malthusianism, all of that. And the right is also free to just be whatever it is. And the main right-wing degrowth is austerity, right? Is just cut your way into economic growth, right? I mean, that's the economics they've been pushing really, really hard since the 1970s. This idea that if we just cut government spending on everything, the economy will magically bounce back because people will have more money to spend, which is not how that works. When people have less money to, when working people, like the bulk of the population, when they have less money in their pockets because you take away, any programs that would assist them, you get rid of government jobs and all of that, then they don't have more money to spend and the economy doesn't go further. The ultra rich, with so much wealth, they only invest that huge amount of wealth if they can get a return on it. They're not sitting there spending it just because you cut their taxes. And austerity economics was the main push for degrowth in the 70s and 80s. The idea if we just get the government out of everything, it'll magically lead to economic expansion. And that's just not the truth. And that was austerity. But now we see like the other side of it, which is, instead of just cutting government subsidies, we use the government to forcibly degrow. And that's what's coming from the left. And that is just as dangerous because it's both premised on this idea that the way things will get better is if everyone just has less. And that is just not reality. That's just not how economics works.
I mean, if you think about it, it's just a totally absurd prospect, the idea that taking things from people makes their lives better. It's just, it should be so apparent to any person who is thinking for moments that that's a problem. But I think just to go back to something else you said, I think that the being aligned with the Soviet Union is it's really a good example of the reason why the left was kind of able to, if not necessarily be fundamentally based on class politics, but align itself with class politics, is just that it was a superpower that was communist, and it wasn't bad for communists to align themselves with, or people calling themselves communists or leftists or whoever. In the perception, which is an idealist concept. The perception was that the Soviet Union was leftist, even though you could argue that very much, in my opinion, because you have people who are now looking back at the Soviet Union as bad and right wing because of various social policies it had, which again is specifically why it's not really good to affiliate with these things, because you start splitting along these social policies and along these lines that are based on identity as opposed to class. But you had that large already existing socialism country that people were, I mean, in the circles of the left, allowed to support and affiliate themselves with it. And that's a kind of accountability that I think they worked, obviously, the last entire century to erode. That's, I mean, we talk about it in the documentary. We've got the, like you brought up, the Congress for Cultural Freedom, and I bring up the hippies. I bring up, you know, various things that transformed what people considered to be the left into these identity and individual prospects. Like the hippies were instrumental in making the left reject the Soviet Union, to be frank. Like the hippies had this very anti-materialist viewpoint and anti. They would tell you need to consume the right things, more or less. They would not talk about it as consumption, but you would have to make these choices within the individual sphere that ultimately, as neoliberalism was sort of budding into the world, the entire world becomes a social market and your choices become consumer choices. That's essentially what the hippie movement normalized. And a lot of people say, well, the hippies were radical. They didn't want capitalism. Well, you know what? A lot of leftists today don't want capitalism, and we cover that very much. I'm particularly proud of the segment about the adapter with the two prongs. The adapter for like an electric cord that has three prongs. You have three-prong electrical cords nowadays. That's how they are. And there are a lot of old outlets and rentals and older houses that have two prongs. And if you want to plug a three-prong into a two-prong, you need to put it in an adapter. And that adapter, I'm saying, is ideology. It can make the three-prong, which is a fundamentally different thing from the two-prong, at least in concern. The three-prong is the anti-capitalist. The two-prong is the existing system. You put the adapter in, that adapter's ideology, and suddenly these people who don't want capitalism are doing things that support capitalism. I mentioned the AI plagiarism thing. It's such a perfect example of this sort of people who claim to be anti-capitalist and don't want these big corporations ruining everything, man. But they can't see that AI itself is a tool, and that you dichotomize automation and tools from business and industry and capitalism. Yes, certainly this tool can be used for bad, but it can be used for good too. And they can't understand that prospect because they're so enamored with the idea of making it these temporarily embarrassed millionaire, content landlord people who are like, well, I got to support the bourgeois property dynamics. It's really important that nobody rips off Disney because someday I might be in a position that is vaguely similar to Disney with my intellectual property. We constantly see this dichotomy appearing in various, it's not just AI and intellectual property. That's just an easy one because it's art and it's very visible. But as we see this dynamic emerge in other areas, like you talk a lot about self-driving cars and how great that would be if we weren't in capitalism. You mind running through that real quick?
Well, sure. I've often made the point that, if we had self-driving cars, which is something that is widely acknowledged we're going to have within the next couple of years, it's been pointed out, Andrew Yang talked to the New York Times, and I always quote it, where he said, if we had self-driving cars, that would lead to riots in the streets. There'd be mass unemployment, millions of truck drivers out of work, millions of Uber drivers out of work, all the traffic courts shut down. It would be an absolute disaster in terms of unemployment. And that doesn't make any sense. Why should that be the case? Shouldn't it be a great thing if we advance technology to the point that this chore, this expenditure of human labor time and human labor power called driving was no longer necessary? That would be a great advance. But in our irrational, system where production is organized for profit and your only value is your ability to sell yourself to your employer, self-driving cars would lead to economic ruin. And that doesn't make sense. And that points to the fundamental problem with the capitalist mode of production, as further expounded on by Marx when he talks about the tendency of the falling rate of profit, the problem of overproduction, or you talk about value crisis, because people think overproduction means we are problem that economic advancement under capitalism is in opposition to technological advancement. That as technology increases, society gets poorer, and this is not rational. That's the point that largely can't be repeated over and over and over again enough, and that it explains why we're in the crisis that we're in. The economic crisis that we're in is exactly what Marx wrote about the great technological advances leading to economic catastrophe, because we're living in a period where the computer revolution has made capitalism unsustainable.
And the thing is, when we talk about the left versus the right, and you brought this up with the sort of post-Obama era that you were talking about, that sort of confusion as to what these things are, is because these are idealist constructs. They're not class constructs. It was formerly at least affiliated with a class because there was a large, very large entity in the Soviet Union sort of holding that accountable. But this left-right thing, I mean, you can find people on the right that hate AI. You can find people on the left that hate AI. And it sounds like it's for completely different reasons, but ultimately it comes into market saturation. They don't want like people out there to fill up the market with easy art, fake art, as they call it, and making it more difficult for them to become no longer temporarily embarrassed millionaires. It's such a like, I like to use the Ouroboros as an image, the snake eating its own tail. We see that so constantly with the left-right dichotomy, in my opinion. And to bring up Woke Ouroboros, my book, which talks about how wokeness is sort of a racism, but it's good thing. Like we talk about leftism, but it's good in the documentary. Or sorry, left, but it's yes, but it's good leftism. It's the concept that I have where after the Red Scare, the time of the world where all of these things were being demonized, and you were a subversive and a bad person if you were a leftist or a communist or any of those things. After that, there was sort of an embrace of all of those things just to argue against it. Like, you think I want to destroy your family? Yes, but it's good. I am a leftist, blah, blah, blah. And the Woke Ouroboros is just kind of a centering on the concept of racism versus anti-racism, or bigotry versus anti-bigotry. It ties into what this documentary is about, although the documentary itself is a lot more generalized, and I think talks about things in a way that's a little more less hyper specific and maybe a little more historical for a while, but also talks about the fact that degrowth leads us to these suicidal, homicidal, or genocidal ideologies where we're killing ourselves, we're doing terrorism, or we're setting up the economy, or like in ways that sort of will end up ultimately killing people, whether they're ourselves or others. And those ideologies bring people to tragedy. Like, that's how I open up part 3 in this documentary, talking about Aaron Bushnell and Maxwell Azzarello and the author.
Yeah, and somebody else tried to do it just recently. I saw an NBC reporter. I mean, and that this is these ideologies that are within the confines of the system, they lead people to be suicidal because they don't see any way out, right? And that was a very powerful point you made in the film. And that was one place where I strayed with the left, and I wasn't as vocal about it as you were, because I wanted to be cautious, because I know there are a lot of people that follow my work that are really sympathizing with the Palestinians, which I obviously am, and I mean are very anti-Israel, which I obviously am, but But at the same time, they feel like anything that would raise awareness would be important. And so I can sympathize with that. And I didn't want to, make it sound like I was attacking those people. But my sentiment was with you. We should not be promoting suicide. And when
No.
I saw the reaction, the social media and the general left reaction to Aaron Bushnell's self-immolation, I was horrified. Like, this is not what we should be promoting. We should be giving people a real movement they could join, that could really change society. We shouldn't be, telling people, oh, the best thing you can do is go light yourself on fire. That was
Yeah.
absolutely awful. And that, and that then my critique of the Palestine movement was they should be doing what we did, right? Where you make a message that could resonate with the bulk of the population. Money for jobs and schools in America, not for Israel, right? Aim at winning over the
Yep.
bulk of the population. But the Palestine movement is largely just kind of a movement that's just kind of express your anger and, all this like leftist, standard leftist, disapproval of US society is no good, shaking your finger at US society. And then glorifying, then people that would then, take their own life as if that's the answer. And it is clearly not, and I mean, as an organizer, you have a moral responsibility. People listen to you. And I was just horrified to see that so many leftist influencers just saying, oh, great, this guy killed himself. That's great. It's like,
Yeah.
no, I'm in this to stop people from killing themselves. I'm in this to enable people to understand that human progress can continue advancing beyond the artificial restraints and limits of this irrational capitalist system. That's the point, right? Progress can continue, but this irrational system where profit dictates production has got to be overcome. That's the point.
Absolutely. And the thing is, I certainly don't wish to insult Aaron Bushnell or Maxwell Azarello or the third gentleman that you mentioned. I don't know his name. Um, I don't want to disrespect those people because I think that, in their world, this is sort of like the ultimate leftist thing you can do. It's the thing that you do to prove like you're very serious about this cause. And I don't think that's bad in terms of like where it's coming from. I just don't think that I think that it's tragic these people died. I don't think that they're heroes. I think that they're victims of imperialism. I think that they are people who have been terrorized in so many ways. Maybe not in the same way that the Palestinians are being terrorized by Israel currently, but they are terrorized. They're pushed into this idea that they can't really do anything. So it paints them into this corner where they think the only thing I can do, the only way out, and also the only way I can tell them I'm truly serious is by killing themselves. And there are people who associate that with a lack of mental health, and I would argue that most people have some kind of mental health problem. I wouldn't necessarily place it entirely on that with these folks because I think most people suffer from some form of depression nowadays. They've done everything they can to ensure that people do. So I don't necessarily place it in that area. And a lot of people do like think that when you're saying it's a tragedy, they're not heroes. I'm just saying, well, they were mentally ill and they killed themselves because of that. And it's like, no, it's not. It's not that. Like I respect these people. I respect their conviction. I respect their opinion too. Like I agree with them. They're not wrong. They're just killing themselves, and that's horrible. We don't want that. We want people to live long and productive and happy lives where they get what they want out of the world and they get what they need out of society. These are not like good things. It's not is something that advances the cause. It in fact turns people off. The same thing goes for stopping traffic. Like I endlessly get shit for criticizing that as a method of protest, but all you're doing is just stopping working people from getting to their jobs. And people's jobs are so expendable nowadays. It is not a worthwhile withholding of labor. It's such a like surface level thing to do that ultimately you're just turning the populace against your cause. The Palestinian movement has certainly done that in a lot of these instances. And then there's the throwing tomato soup on art and painting Stonehenge orange. Like this stuff doesn't help. It makes people who would otherwise maybe listen to you, like the Palestine thing was like such a big opportunity to show what imperialism is doing in the world, because Israel is so blatantly a client state. It's such a blatant relationship. We're just sending as much money as we can to them, and they're just killing like indiscriminately in such a callous way. Like, it's not because they're defending themselves. Like, if you look at the death counts between Israel and Palestine just over the last year, you're talking about a couple thousand versus over 100,000. It's not even comparable what's going on in these places. And you know, you're bad for pointing this out because you're associated with these people that like don't make it about how it would benefit me not to be at war with them. Like, there's no reason to be at war. There's no reason to be funding war. There's no reason to have war other than the crisis of overproduction necessitates war. Um, it's stupid, and this is the stuff that we're trying to hammer into people's heads. And there's a lot of resistance from the left because, you know, I mean, you know this probably more than anybody. The left fucking hates it when you're not going along with everything they're saying, but everything they're saying ultimately defends the way things are.
Exactly. I mean, and you and I have always been serious about what we're doing. And so rather than just pander to what is already popular and engage in what's called tailism, what Lenin called tailism, where you just chase after sentiments that are already there and try to get clout by saying what people already think, we're actually trying to do the pioneering work of saying, how can we improve things? How can we get better? We're actually trying to teach people. And that is a much more difficult task because you don't get rewarded for doing that, right? You're challenging things, but you know, when I think about left and right, I'm forced to think about in ancient Rome. You know, you had two schools of thought among landowning Romans. You had hedonists and Stoics, and they were both, you know, basically destructive degrowth ideologies. The hedonists believed pleasure was the highest good, and they had the orgies and the wild parties. You know, they talk about Emperor Claudius. He would stuff his face full of food, and then he had a servant who would stuff a feather down his throat to tickle him so he could vomit it all up, and then go and stuff his face some more, because that was hedonism. Pleasure was the highest good. And then among the Romans who just couldn't find satisfaction in being a hedonist, they had Stoicism, which was the opposite. And, you know, people would starve themselves and whip themselves. And it was like, oh, I'm going to endure hardship in order to feel like I'm good. But both hedonism and Stoicism were destructive worldviews, more or less. I mean, it was about, oh, we're going to tear ourselves down, right? They weren't about making people better, right? You're you know, degrading yourself into an animal as a hedonist, or you're literally, you know, harming yourself as a stoicist. But either way, you were reducing your humanity, right? Which, I mean, the symbol of the Roman Empire was, I mean, you know, the founding myth was Romulus and Remus, two brothers who were left to die by the river and then were raised by wild wolves. You know, they were raised by, you know, the she wolf. They had the statue of the female wolf nursing the two twin boys, and it was like the Roman Empire was almost like a revolt against humanity itself, right? It was like, we will become like wild predator animals, and it was this predatory empire that dominated the world and ultimately became a check holding back human progress, and ultimately fell because it was at odds with human advancement. Their slave mode of production just couldn't continue advancing, and human creativity had gone to higher stages. And, you know, feudalism was a much more productive economic model than slavery, and the Roman Empire was against human progress, and ultimately it came down. And I think about that. You know, Karl Kautsky wrote his very important book, which I learned a lot from. It's called The Foundations of Christianity. But in that book, he talks not just about, you know, Jews in Palestine and Jesus, but he also talks about the Roman Empire and the economic foundations of it, the origins of the proletariat as a class. But in that book, he has a big section talking about the hedonists and the stoicists. And I think, really, if you look at it, you know, the right are the hedonists in our time, and the left are the stoicists. And you and I are neither hedonists nor stoicists. We are believers in historical progress and wanting human beings to fulfill their potential and wanting to march history forward, which is against what the empire, capitalism in its monopolistic stage, imperialism, is just fundamentally against human progress. And we are in favor of human progress, and that puts us at odds with the entire empire.
Yeah. And to be frank, another good time to mention our event on Saturday in Chicagoland area. If you're interested, please go to cpiusa.org. Caleb and I are going to be doing an event this weekend, or this upcoming weekend. I guess it's still the weekend now, but this upcoming weekend, we're going to be, we both have presentations. Mine is going to be on Fandom. Caleb has a fairly wide-reaching program he's going to address. But we're also going to be doing workshops. We're going to be doing more interactive presentations. We're going to be filming our presentations, but not going to be filming other stuff, because we want people to come, and we really want to interact with people, because we're hoping to start setting a precedent where, I mean, just as we're talking about with what we want for people, growth, we also want to grow the sort of innovationism movement we're starting. It's certainly not, outside of the realm of, what we would traditionally call Marxism, but it's oriented towards today. It's oriented in a way to show other people why it's important to think about these things via class, why it's important to think about them via production and the stages of production and the contradictions of production. Like, we always come back to the crisis of overproduction, the value crisis that we constantly have. And we should, because frankly, it's the reason why capitalism is a problem. The problems of capitalism that people generally talk about that they don't like are exploitation, the unequal nature of the 1% versus the 99%. And certainly those things are bad. I don't like those things. Those are problems, but it's not the actual real core of why we need to move on from capitalism. We need to move on from capitalism because it's mathematically unsustainable, and that's what leads us back to degrowth. We have periods of growth where we go well beyond what is sustainable for the society. It breaks down, and we have to either get into a war, or we have to do neoliberalism and austerity. And that's exactly what we were talking about earlier. The event we're having in Chicagoland, Working Families First, fight. I forgot the subtitle, but it's Working Families First. I'm really excited about it because I don't get to go to these as much as I want to. But this one's actually a lot closer to where I live. And I'm very excited to see people, both familiar faces and new faces. And, I would definitely encourage everybody who is watching this to register and come. It's a little outside of Chicago. It's not in the direct metro. It's in the Chicagoland area. But I would say, the reason why we should be at these types of things is because, we've outlined a set of problems during the course of this stream so far. And we also, have thoughts on what to do about that aren't just like, well, we got to change this policy, or we got to do this thing. And we need to do things that are more fundamental. And it's not just that, we need to do more of this. The reason I think that the Bernie Sanders campaign ultimately led to so much disappointment is because the philosophy was ultimately, we just need to go further left. We need to do more radical things. Those are quantitative. And although, yes, as Stalin put it, after a large amount of quantitative change, you have qualitative change. But if you're aiming just for ultimately quantitative change, you're not really aiming at the contradictions. You're aiming at, ultimately purity of ideology. You're saying, I got to be more of this. I've got to be more. It's just a quantity of something. And we have to look at things qualitatively. And yes, we do quantitative things in service of that, but it has to be in service of that. It has to be a fundamental change. So again, register, or at least even check it out. If you need to come into the city and, you're worried about the cost of a hotel, we have an Airbnb that is free for anybody who's attending the event to stay in the night before and the night after. Obviously, we have rules in place for what happens there. We don't want booze. We don't want drugs. We don't want shenanigans of any kind. But we have that. There's going to be free food at the event itself. other than getting to the venue, the place that we're doing this at, there's not a lot of friction in terms of it. We're really excited to see people. We want to talk to people about these ideas. So, you know, if you enjoy what's being said here on this stream or in the documentary that we're excited to have people stick around for soon, that's probably a good place to go and to start and to start moving us in the direction we need to go.
Yeah, well, I would say that what's really important, and it comes across in a lot of your work, Peter, is that we are not trying to build a fandom, right? Because ultimately, a fandom is not going to change society. A fandom becomes less and less political over time. It is about kind of just worshiping an individual and following them and being on the blue team or the red team. And anti fandom and fandom are twins. They walk hand in hand, and that ultimately what we need is an organization. And we're in this kind of weird period. We've always been the center for political innovation, but we're really emphasizing that third word, innovation, right now, because really that's what it fundamentally gets down to, right? We celebrate human creativity. And I think, in this period where we have like the rise of artificial intelligence, we're seeing just how far human creativity can go. That aspect of what Marx wrote about celebrating human creativity, is so fundamentally important to understanding it, and especially with the degrowth argument and with leftism deteriorating into what it is. I mean, we have a very unique understanding of the Marxist, economic theories, right? In light of what's happened with China and socialism with Chinese characteristics, and in light of 21st century socialism and the fall of the Soviet Union, but also in light of artificial intelligence and in light of so much, right? We have a school of thought that emphasizes creativity, and ultimately the only way our organization is really going to work is to enable people who join to discover their own creativity, right? We have to ultimately help you to become a creator, help you to innovate and discover and build something of your own that'll be part of our CPI operation. And so it's very exciting, and we're in a time of great change. And it's a great opportunity, and we see joining this organization, being part of the organization, as a great opportunity for you. And a lot of things are changing and shifting, but if we were just trying to build a fandom, Peter and I would operate very, very differently. We would put out a lot of different content and all of that, but we're ultimately looking to build an organization, a real movement that can really change society. So that's why we would like you to come to our events, and that's why we'd like to get to know you as a person. We'd ultimately like you to join the Center for Political Innovation so you can be part of this project. So that's why we're always pushing these events. I know it confuses some people. Some people are like, why do you always want to do events? But it's because we're trying to build a movement. That's why.
We have to do something to gather people in one place, because the internet doesn't do that. The only thing, it creates the image of doing that. We're talking about fandom a lot, and we're starting to get into the last 12 minutes of this stream, so I don't want to get too far into that. But if we don't have connection that isn't mediated by these platforms, it's going to be ultimately subverted into fandom. I mean, I think we both do a pretty good job of fighting fandom, but it's a constant fight. Like, there are people who aren't necessarily like super observant of the types of things we're saying, and are more like interested in like the way we say it. And there are people who I think do the fandom thing with what we do, and I'm certainly not trying to rebuke them in any way, but it is an active thing to fight fandom. You have to constantly be thinking about, how do we make it so that isn't the primary landing spot for the people who hear what we're saying? How do we do something that is different? And we've been talking a lot between you and I about how, in the long term, how are we going to be enabling people? How are we going to be empowering people? How are we going to train people or help them move along? And there's controversial ideas that a regular communist probably would not like things like helping people start businesses at some point, or enabling like some kind of education, at least in that direction. Just any of these types of things where people will be like, business, what? I mean, that's certainly not the only thing that we want to do with CPI, but there are things that I'm sure communists will consider to be very controversial in that. But at the same time, we want people to have better lives. That's ultimately the thing. And we don't live in communism now. We have to live through a big transition to get to communism. And some of the transition is going to require people to have power. And how do you get power in capitalism? By acquiring some capital. Or like, even if it's not like a massive amount of capital, if our people are building power in that way and in other ways, we have more of a chance of moving towards a different stage of production. I mean, we have a lot to talk about in terms of what we're actually planning with those types of things, but it's very different to how a communist organization is generally thinking. They're generally thinking, well, how do we make the biggest spectacle? How do we piss the most people off? How do we show that we're the most leftist or the most communist? And it's not a productive way of doing things because, again, it just creates a consumable leftism, a consumable communism, the aesthetic that people are able to adopt and enjoy, like LARP, ultimately, as a lot of people like to say. We're trying to do something different than that. So I think, we got 9 minutes left until the documentary. The waiting room music will probably start soon. And so we've got a few more minutes to talk. What I would say, do you think is the most important takeaway from the film that we're all about to watch, Caleb?
Well, I think the most important takeaway that I have, because we pre-screened it for a number of people, is how viewable it was to people that are, quote unquote, not political, right? How many people showed it to their relative, their family member, or their coworker, and they got a lot out of it. And that it is an accessible piece. It is made not just for you to enjoy it. You're probably somebody who already agrees with it if you're going to watch it, but it is made to be spread. Send it to your relatives, send it to your family members, get them to watch it and understand it. And a lot of people feel that both sides are bad right now, but they don't quite know why. And this film will help you to understand why, because really at the end of the day, we are appealing to people's innate humanness, their innate drive to create, their innate drive to have more than they already had, to have a better life for their children than they had, to expand, right? We're appealing to people's innate humanity. And right now, the system, the left and the right, are both mobilizing against that innate humanity. So really what we're offering here is something that's going to naturally appeal to most people. If they're not already sucked into some kind of fandom or whatever, they're going to agree with what we have to say. It might be a tough sell. It might be, getting them out of their comfort zone. But ultimately, people are going to find this message very appealing, and it's going to explain a lot of things to them.
I've been really excited about the CPI members that have shown family members, because one thing we have had a lot of CPI people tell us is when they talk about CPI with family kind of zones out a little bit because it's a political thing, it's a communist thing, and there's my cousin talking about communism again. But they've talked about showing this film to people and it having a very different effect than that. And that's probably the thing that excites me most about the film. I am very optimistic at all times. People like to call me a pessimist or a contrarian. I'm actually a very optimistic person. I just don't shy away from criticism like so many people do. A lot of people think that being an optimist means never criticizing anything. That's not it at all. When I see that there are people watching this film and coming back to it and saying, you know what, I kind of actually get what our organization has been saying, because you've been saying this kind of stuff to me for a long time. But this kind of, I try to talk to people in a manner that isn't left poisoned or communism poisoned or direction brained, as I like to say, which is left or right poisoned by ideology. It's really important to try to talk to people in as if I was walking into the grocery store to talk about this shit. It's really important to try not to use the shibboleths and the in-words and the popular terminology, all of that stuff. Like, people don't like that stuff. People don't understand it, and it makes it feel like you're talking down to them. And you're not, because a lot of the stuff that we're saying here, people already know. Like I said, like you said a second ago, people don't like both sides. They just don't necessarily have the analysis that grounds why and connects it to a type of action they can take. And that's why I think the both sides thing gets so much hate. It does ultimately lead to paralysis because nobody's associating it with an analysis. Now, with this film, there is an analysis that you can directly point to that is not poisoned in pure, like, I'm the most leftist person out there. And it's just, that's not part of this. It's just like, I don't want that. I don't want to be affiliated with partisan crap. I don't like it. I don't enjoy it. You know, we have to move beyond this paradigm, left, right. We have to move into a class paradigm. And, you know, in absence of having a large, you know, country, the Soviet Union, a communist country that kind of held people accountable towards the actual project of communism by affiliating themselves with, we need something that you know, changes the paradigm. We need some way to ground our analysis in something that actually moves us towards class. And I think that this is that. After a very long time of working on it, I think this is the thing that can do that, at least to some extent.
Yeah. No, it's a great piece, and I hope people watch, and I hope they engage. It's very good, and it will definitely complement what we're planning to do at our upcoming workshop. So
yeah, I am excited.
Tune in, spread the word, tweet this out, get everybody watching it. You won't regret it. You're going to enjoy this film.
Yeah, you know, watch it, stick with us. Also, Working Families First next Saturday. I again want to hammer that home really quick before we leave the stream. It's going to be, in my opinion, a great event. It's going to be fun for us. It's going to be fun for other people. I also just like being in places I haven't been. Like, I've obviously been in the Chicagoland area, but the exact place we're going to, I didn't even know it existed. It's a smaller town outside of Chicago. It certainly qualifies as part of the Chicagoland area, but it's just exciting to me to go to a new place and potentially see new faces. Like, there are people that, you know, have registered for this that we talked about this earlier. Actually, yesterday and today, we talked about this person who watches my content, who registered and is going to drive in from Minnesota. It's going to be an exciting piece of like community to just participate in that. So I think really important. You go to cpiusa.org. We have information in the news section on there about the event. I would love to see some people who watch this film there. I'd love to talk to them about the film. I'd love to have a meal with them, have a chat, all of that fun stuff. That's what's great about these events. Honestly, you get to it's not just for us, but for other people. You get to meet people who are curious about these same problems. And that's the best part about it for me. Of course, I do love giving presentations too. That's a lot of fun. I am a camera hog, if you let me. But yeah, it's going to be great. Thanks everybody for watching this stream. Thanks a ton to you, Caleb, for streaming with me here today. I think just having a piece of perspective about it that isn't mine, it's kind of helpful, because, you know, I just sound kind of like an asshole if I get on a stream and I'm like, hey, everybody, check out my film. It's the best thing ever. Wow. It doesn't, but thanks a lot for streaming with me.
Absolutely.
And thanks to everybody. Thanks a whole lot to everybody for watching. We're going to shut this stream off. And for everybody on YouTube, it's going to automatically redirect you to the documentary itself. For everybody watching on Facebook, go to youtube.com/@importantDs, as in the first letter of documentary and an S, or just search Horseshoe Theory documentary. I'm pretty sure there's not a whole lot of them, actually, because everybody hates the idea of horseshoe theory. thanks a lot for everybody's time, though. Thanks, Caleb. I'm excited to watch this film with everybody. So let's head that direction, and have a good week, everybody. I will, of course, be talking to you in the chat. So, yeah. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.